Western Spring Television. Ours it is.
Good evening and welcome to Spring Global and Western Spring Television. Now the headlines. President-elect Bola Tinubu reinstates that the unity of Nigeria is non-negotiable. Fierce fighting continues in Sudan's capital despite a supposed 7-day ceasefire. At least 7 teachers killed in shooting at a school in northwestern Pakistan. My name is Femi Olanipekun. The president-elect Bola Tinubu has said the unity of Nigeria is non-negotiable, assuring all citizens that it will be fair to all. Tinubu said this when he commissioned the Magistrate Court Complex in Port Harcourt, the Rivers State capital, at the instance of Governor Nyesom Wike. The president-elect, who ended his 2-day official visits to the oil-rich South state today, said Nigerians must tolerate one another. The All Progressives Congress APC power broker said himself and Wike, a chieftain of the People's Democratic Party PDP, are promoting unity despite not being members of the same political party. Tinubu, a former Lagos State governor, further promised to review the welfare of judges after he is sworn in on May 29, 2023.
I really thank you for being my friend. I fulfilled the promise that I made to the people of Rivers State. And that's what I intend to do in all policy formations coming up. Promise Nigerians the unity of this country is not negotiable. That's what is Wike and I are promoting jointly. I promise I'll be fair to all.
And outside of Nigeria, fierce fighting is continuing in Khartoum, the Sudanese capital, as the army tries to push back the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, RSF, from around the presidential palace and army headquarters, in spite of a supposed 7-day ceasefire. Heavy bombardments were also reported this morning in Khartoum's sister cities of Omdurman and Khartoum. Sudanese reports on Tuesday said 550 people had died and 4,926 people wounded so far in the conflict. The sides appear to be battling for territory in the capital before any possible negotiation, though the two leaders have shown little willingness to hold talks. In a related development, the UN's top aid official has warned that the will to end the conflict still is not there after speaking to Sudan's rival military leaders. Martin Griffiths told the BBC that Sudan's descent into violence was now at a dangerous tipping point. He further called for security guarantees from the warring sides to allow humanitarian aid into the country. The UN warns that the fighting could force hundreds of thousands of Sudanese to flee their homes.
We're asking for the movement of humanitarian supplies and people. We do this in every other country. Even without ceasefires, it's a tradition, the humanitarian enterprise, to go where others don't. And we will need to have agreement at the highest level and very publicly, and we will need to deliver those commitments into local arrangements that can be depended on.
Elsewhere, Pope Francis has sacked a Rwandan-born man, Wenceslas Muyenshaka, who has been serving as a clergyman in northern France for almost 3 decades from priesthood. A communique circulating online signed by the Bishop of Everix revealed that Mr. Munyeshaka, aged 64, automatically loses clerical rights and is excluded from serving as a priest. The office of the Diocese of Everett confirmed the authenticity of the communique, which it said was based on a papal decree dated March. Mr. Munyeshaka, who fled to France after the Rwandan genocide in 1994, hasn't commented on the decision. He was suspended by his diocese in December 2021 after it emerged that he legally acknowledged being the father of a 10-year-old boy. And still in Africa, the World Food Programme and USAID have suspended food deliveries in Tigray in northern Ethiopia following the discovery that relief aid had been stolen. The USAID Administrator Samantha Power said food shipments had been diverted and sold on the local market. She said deliveries would resume once there was confidence that the aids would reach the intended population who are facing famine. Meanwhile, the interim leader of Tigray, Getachew Reda, says he's setting up a task force to tackle aid theft. Millions of people in Tigray suffer from food shortages after a two-year war between Ethiopian government forces and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. And to the Russia-Ukraine war, President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Russian forces of committing some 6,139 war crimes in April alone. Mr. Zelensky made this known in his address to the International Criminal Court in The Hague this morning, noting that the crimes have led to the deaths of 207 Ukrainian civilians, including 11 children. He further called for the creation of a war tribunal which must transform the experience of the Nuremberg process.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Thursday visited the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which in March issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin for suspected deportation of children from Ukraine, calling for the creation of a war crimes tribunal separate to the International Criminal Court. He is expected to meet with Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, as well as members of the country's parliament, in his first visit to the Netherlands. President Zelensky started a speech titled "No Peace Without Justice" for Ukraine by thanking his audience for having him in The Hague. Speaking in English, he expressed his gratitude for their attention and respect for his country and for those who value freedom and do not tolerate tyranny.
We can now stop wars of aggression as such. We can defeat aggression as a criminal idea that originates in the mindset of someone who is used to impunity. Impunity is the key that opens the door to aggression. If you look at any war, any war of aggression in the history, they all have one thing in common. The perpetrators of the war didn't believe they would have to stand to answer for what they did. They must stand to answer for war. However brings war must receive judgment.
Russia, which is not a member of the ICC and rejects its jurisdiction, denies committing atrocities during its conflict with Ukraine, which it terms a special operation to demilitarize its neighbor. The Ukrainian president says some 6,139 war crimes have been committed by Russians alone in April. He added that these crimes have led to the deaths of 207 Ukrainian civilians, including 11 children. He mentioned an attack on Kherson yesterday, which killed 23 and injured another 49, the millions of strikes in the Donbas region, people killed during the occupation of Bucha, an alleged filtration camp that Russia has set up in Ukraine's independent land, as well as every prisoner tortured in Russian captivity and every city bombed by Russia. In light of all the attacks by Russia, Zelensky led a minute of silence in memory of the lives lost following the invasion. Zelensky thanked the Dutch political leadership for being with Ukraine on its part. He also praised the Netherlands for honoring the memories of lives lost in the Second World War. While the ICC does not have jurisdiction over alleged crimes of aggression, the European Commission, among others, have already brought its support for the creation of a separate international center for the prosecution of the crime of aggression in Ukraine that would be set up in The Hague. Russia has accused Ukraine of attempting an overnight drone attack on the Kremlin with the aim of killing President Vladimir Putin, the most dramatic charge Moscow has leveled against Kyiv since the war on its neighbor began. The allegation was made on Wednesday by the Russian government. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky denied the accusations, saying his country had not attacked Moscow or its president.
We don't attack Putin or Moscow. We fight on our territory. We are defending our villages and cities. We don't have, enough weapon for this. That's why we don't use it anywhere. For us, that is the deficit. We can't spend it. And we didn't attack Putin. We leave it to tribunal.
Temitope Ajijola Oluola, Western Spring Television News.
Meanwhile, White House National Security spokesman John Kirby says Russia's claims that the U.S. was behind a drone attack on the Kremlin are false. Mr. Kirby, in a news chat, said the United States was in no way involved with the incident, adding that Washington does not encourage or enable Ukraine to strike outside its borders. Mr. Kirby further stated that it was still unclear what exactly happened and that Washington was still looking into the incident. Earlier, Russia had accused the United States of being behind what it says was a drone attack on Moscow's Kremlin citadel intended to kill President Vladimir Putin.
I would just tell you Mr. Peskov's lying. I mean, that's obviously, it's a ludicrous claim. The United States had nothing to do with this. We don't even know exactly what happened here, Caitlin, but I can assure you the United States had no role in it whatsoever. And again, just to be clear, and I think you covered this at the beginning, we neither encourage nor do we enable Ukraine to strike outside Ukraine's borders. But we honestly just don't know what happened here. I think here's another thing that happened, though, Poppy.
Sure.
In just the last 48 hours or so, Mr. Putin has continued to rain down on Ukraine cruise missiles and drones and conducting other kinds of airstrikes, and just yesterday killed 23 innocent civilians in a residential complex that they hit, likely intentionally. So that's also what's happening, and I think we can't forget that.
Similarly, the EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell has warned Russia against using the alleged drone attack to escalate its war in Ukraine. Mr. Borrell, speaking to journalists as he attended an EU ministers' meeting in Brussels, called on Moscow not to use the alleged attack as an excuse to continue the escalation of the war. Mr. Borrell said he had heard President Zelensky deny that Ukraine was behind the attack and said Ukraine was not involved in the attacks. He noted that Kyiv is defending its country, fighting on their soil, and are not attacking Russian soil. And elsewhere in Europe, 8 people have died in a fire in the second largest city in the Czech Republic, according to police. The fire broke out this morning in Brno, located 125 miles southeast of Prague. The victims are yet to be identified. Police suggested those who died were likely unhoused people occupying construction containers in a new neighborhood that is expected to be built in the coming years. According to local TV, the fire engulfed about 12 containers at the edge of an apartment complex before being extinguished. You're watching Spring Global on Western Spring Television. I'll be right back after this break.
Prince Royal was born 6th of December 1910 at Raba Village, Sokoto, northwestern Nigeria. His father was a district head and heir apparent to the Sultanate throne from the house of Usmanu Danfodio, a religious and social reformer who brought the Habib dynasty under the Fulani Caliphate in the beginning of the 19th century. Ahmadu Bello raised the bar of political consciousness and participation when, in 1944, he engineered the establishment establishment of the Northern People's Congress (NPC) as the first political party in northern Nigeria and the rallying point for politicians in the region before independence. History will not forget Ahmadu Bello for his charisma and political sagacity, which provided easy passage for his kinsmen to assume political and administrative positions in Nigeria's post-independence era. The distinguished elder statesman and Sardauna of Sokoto has his face on his country's 200 naira currency as a mark of honor to one of the architects of Nigeria's independence. Western Spring Television identifies Ahmadu Bello as a watershed character in history.
Welcome back. In Asia, at least 7 teachers have been killed in a shooting at a school in northwestern Pakistan following a separate attack in which another teacher was shot dead. Both incidents took place this morning in the Parachina area of Kuram Tribal District near the border with Afghanistan. The motive behind the killings remained unclear, but the teachers killed in both incidents belonged to the country's Shia Muslim minority. According to local television channel, the incident took place in an area that has witnessed sectarian violence between Shia and Sunni tribes in the past. Local police said they were gathering more information and investigating the incident. In the meantime, China has said high vigilance was needed in the face of NATO's eastward expansion. Following a media report, the alliance is planning to set up an office in Japan to facilitate consultations with allies in the region. The Nikkei Asia had yesterday reported that NATO was planning to open its first liaison office in Asia, in Japan, to facilitate talks with security partners such as South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. However, spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, Mao Ning, said Asia was a promising land for cooperation and development and should not be a battle arena for geopolitics. Ms. Mao noted that NATO's continual eastward expansion in the Asia-Pacific attempts to destroy regional peace and stability as well as push for bloc confrontation. And still in Asia, the United States has laid out in clear terms the extent of its defense treaty commitments to the Philippines, issuing new guidelines that refer specifically to attacks in the South China Sea, including on its Coast Guard. The 6-page bilateral defense guidelines agreed in Washington yesterday follows a renewed push under President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. to update the Mutual Defense Treaty with the former colonial ruler at a time of increased tension and maritime confrontation with China. The guidelines said the bilateral treaty commitments would be invoked if either is attacked specifically in the South China Sea and also if Coast Guard vessels were the target. It was also updated to include references to modern forms of warfare, including gray zone tactics, which China is accused of using to assert its claims to sovereignty. The guidelines, however, did not mention China specifically. And in the Middle East, the Israeli army has killed at least 3 Palestinians and wounded 4 others while firing live ammunition during a raid in the northern city of Nablus. The Palestinian Ministry of Health confirmed 3 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces this morning. The Israeli Army and Intelligence Service said in a statement that 2 of the men killed were behind the shooting on April 7th, north of Jericho. Political factions in Nablus announced a general strike in the city today in response to the attack. In the United States, police have arrested a suspect in a mass shooting at a medical center that killed 1 person and wounded 4, after which the gunman stole a truck and fled the scene. The suspect, identified as Dion Patterson, aged 24, was taken into custody yesterday without incident after an undercover officer spotted him north of Atlanta, hours after the midday shooting at the Northside Medical Facility in the capital of the southern state of Georgia. Atlanta's Deputy Police Chief of Criminal Investigations, Charles Hampton, disclosed at a news briefing that the suspect had an appointment at the facility, but the motive for the shooting is still under investigation. Atlanta Police Chief Darren Shebam told an earlier news conference that it was too early in the investigation to determine if the 5 women who were shot were patients or employees.
12:08 this afternoon, we were called just down the street to 1110 West P Street. This is a medical facility, the Northside Hospital, that is at that location. This shooting did occur inside the waiting room of that medical facility, where 5 individuals were shot. Unfortunately, a 39-year-old female has lost her life, and of those that are injured is a 71-year-old female, a 56-year-old female, a 39-year-old female, and then a 25-year-old female. We do know that Mr. Patterson, our suspect, left the building. We believe he carjacked a vehicle a short distance away and was able to flee the scene as the law enforcement agencies were descending on this area. And we believe he has left the area. He may not still be in that vehicle. So I don't ever want to be focused on the vehicle, which has been recovered. So the photograph that has been distributed, for your viewers, your listeners, to be very mindful of that photograph. If you see this individual who may or may not still be in the same hoodie, please call 911 right away or use Crime Stoppers to be able to provide an anonymous tip to where he may be. As the mayor said, we have a multi-jurisdictional effort underway to bring this individual to justice and ensure that we remove him from the street. Everyone consider him still armed and presenting a danger to whatever community he may find himself in at this time.
In other news, the end of a market punishing rate hiking cycle may be in sight, but uncertainty in the U.S. stock valuations and economic outlook is keeping investors on alert for more turbulence ahead. The Federal Reserve yesterday signaled it may pause interest rate increases after raising rates by 500 basis points over the last 14 months to fight inflation in its most aggressive monetary policy, tightening since the 1980s. In theory, the news should be welcome for stocks and other so-called risk assets, which wilted under the barrage of hikes last year. Yet some investors worry this year's 6.5% rebound in the S&P 500 has made equities expensive. Stocks fell yesterday, with the S&P 500 ending down 0.7% after the Fed's latest policy decision, in which the central bank also raised rates by 25 basis points as markets expected. And while India and Russia have suspended efforts to settle bilateral trade in rupees after months of negotiations failed to convince Moscow to keep rupees in its coffers, 2 Indian government officials with direct knowledge of the matter confirmed the development. These would be a major setback for Indian importers of cheap oil and coal from Russia, who are awaiting a permanent rupee payment mechanism to help lower currency conversion costs. With a high trade gap in favor of Russia, Moscow believes it will end up with an annual rupee surplus of over $40 billion if such mechanism is worked out, and feels rupee accumulation is not desirable. But some sports stories. Roma boss Jose Mourinho says he wore a microphone to protect himself against the worst referee he had met in his life during his side's 1-1 draw with Monza yesterday. Mourinho criticized referee Daniel Schiffe after he sent off Roma's Mehmet Zeki Çelik in the 96th minute. He has received 3 red cards this season for disputes with officials, including one from Schiffe in September. Mourinho, speaking after the game, said he went to the game with a microphone, noting that from the moment he left the locker room to the moment he returned, he recorded everything. He lambasted Schiffe over as worst technically, with 0 empathy, 0 communication, and 0 awareness. Stephen El Shaarawy's opening goal was cancelled out by Monza's Luca Caldirola, with the results leaving Roma 7th in Serie A. And Spain's professional soccer clubs reduced their losses in 2021-2022 by more than 6 times to 140 million euros, as revenues rose by 23%, largely recovering from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. La Liga announced these, stating that the season's net deficit was the smallest among Europe's 5 main leagues, which lost a combined 3.1 billion euros. La Liga expects the current season to produce a net profit of just below 30 million euros, still far from levels reached in the pre-COVID years. COVID restrictions hit ticket sales and player transactions in 2020-2021, leading to the Spanish League's first loss since 2012. But before we end Spring Global, here is a recap of our top stories. The president-elect Bola Tinubu has said the unity of Nigeria is non-negotiable, assuring all citizens that it will be fair to all. And fierce fighting is continuing in Khartoum, the Sudanese capital, as the army tries to push back the paramilitary rapid support forces from around the presidential palace and the army headquarters. And at least 7 teachers have been killed in a shooting at a school in northwestern Pakistan following a separate attack in which another teacher was shot dead. You can follow us on all of our social media handles on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Western Spring Television. You can also watch us live on our YouTube channel at Western Spring Television. My name is Femi Olanikpekun. Good evening.
Society of Engineers Osogbo branch invites the general public to the inauguration ceremony of Engineer Wasiu Olalekan Idowu as